is Matt DeLockery, and when I was growing up, I missed out on some answers to some serious questions I was having. Join me as I seek answers to those questions. So, if you're watching this on YouTube, something should be really obvious by now. You're actually watching this instead of just staring at a static picture. So, I've got the video together, and I plan to continue that going forward. Please let me know in the comments if something looks wrong or if there's something that I can improve. I've already recorded this whole series, but I will work on fixing any mistakes for the next one. For those of you who are listening to this on podcast, there's actually video now on my YouTube channel. There's a link in the description of this episode. It's nothing special, it's just me talking into the camera on my laptop. But if you're one of those people who would prefer to watch something instead of just listening to it, that's an option now. So if you want to stare at my face for however long this episode's going to be, you can do that. I wouldn't recommend it, but you're welcome to. Anyway, my YouTube channel actually has video now and not just audio. And I've also put some short videos up there that aren't on the podcast. So feel free to check those out. So all that's happening. Now, before we get into the actual episode, I need to cover one more thing, and that's an apology. It's been a really long time since I've come out with a series, and I am sorry for that. As you will see, though, it's not just like I've been sitting here idle. There's actually a reason this has taken so long. You see, I wanted to answer the question, who was Jesus? And that's a really big question. I figured it was going to take a while to answer it, but as I started doing the research necessary to make the series good, the notes that I was putting together started getting longer and longer and longer. So it's going to be a big series, and it's going to take a while. Written out, it's almost the length of a book. And that's because the question, who was Jesus, is a really big question, and it's not simple to answer. And I've done everything that I can to try to make this worth your time. So, moving forward, long periods of time between series will probably be the rule rather than the exception. You see, I want to give you something that's worth listening to and is really worth your time. Most of us are short on time, and if we're going to waste our time on something, we're going to do it on something fun, not something educational. If we're going to spend our time on something educational, we want something that's going to be really high quality and is going to give us just the things we need to know and keep the time to a minimum. That's what I'm trying to do with this, even though the time is pretty long. It is, I hope, something that is going to be worth your time and is going to be a good resource that you can come back to later on in the future if you need to. So, in order to do that, though, in order to provide these sorts of resources for you, it's going to take a long time to put these series together. So, I hope you'll forgive me if it's been more than a few months since you've last heard from me. I haven't gone anywhere. I've just been working on the next series, and it takes a while. And that's probably going to continue going forward. If you need something to work on with each series, I usually give you one or more books you can read if you want to pursue the topic further. You might try looking into one of those. Again, I'm only going to recommend resources that will be worth your time, if you're interested in the topic, that is. You don't have to read all of them. Or you can just wait for the next series to come out. That's cool too. Anyway, I think that should probably bring you up to date on where I've been and the changes that have happened and how things are going to look going forward. Now it's time to get into the question that this series hopes to answer. Who was Jesus? The thing is, that's actually a harder question to answer than most of us might realize. You see, when people talk about Jesus and share what they think about him, they usually end up revealing more about themselves than about who Jesus actually was. And this is not just something that only the average person does. The modern quest for the historical Jesus, the attempt by scholars to get past all the biases of the gospel authors and find out who Jesus actually was in history. This modern quest for the historical Jesus began in the late 18th century. And scholars wrote about what they thought the historical Jesus looked like. And it's been frequently noted by scholars of all sorts of beliefs, whether they're left, right, center. Everybody has frequently noted that the books on the historical Jesus, known as the Lives of Jesus, frequently revealed more about the authors than about the actual Jesus. But we can forgive them for this. After all, it's not easy to explain who Jesus was, and there are many big hurdles to jump over. Let me give you just a few. First and most obvious is, where do we look for information? You see, the most complete records of Jesus' life are the Gospels that we find in the Bible. I mean, there are sources that mention Jesus outside the Bible, and we're going to talk about them. But the problem is that they usually are later and or don't have near the amount of information that the Gospels do. So we're basically stuck with the Gospels as our main sources. The good thing is that there's a lot of information there. The bad thing is that the writers were obviously biased. They are definitely trying to promote a particular point of view, just like everyone who writes a book, or makes a podcast for that matter. So, where do we look for information about who Jesus was if all our sources are biased? The second hurdle that we have to jump over is also about biases, but it's not about the biases of the authors of the Gospels. It's about our biases. When we look at the Gospels, the earliest full accounts of Jesus' life, we come at them with our own ideas, preconceptions, and preferences. For example, miracles. Do you believe that miracles are possible or not? Your answer to this one question will greatly change your view of who Jesus was. If you're a Christian, you're going to have no problem with miracles because, of course, Jesus did miracles, right? If you're a theist of some sort, you might believe that miracles are theoretically possible, but you might be hesitant to think that Jesus actually did them. You're probably going to want to see some evidence. If you're an atheist, you're probably not going to believe that miracles are even possible at all. So obviously Jesus was not doing miracles. Clearly he must have been doing something else. You see why our biases make a difference? It's really hard to separate who we think Jesus was from how we view the world. The third hurdle we're going to have to get over deals with looking at the person of Jesus himself. You see, Jesus was an amazing person. As long as the basic information we have about him is true, that's just a fact. That doesn't mean that he is who Christianity says he is. That just means he led a highly unusual life, and a whole lot of people either loved him or hated him. And anytime you look at an amazing person, it's hard to be objective. As I was putting my thoughts together on who Jesus was, I was reading a book on all the different opinions people have about who Winston Churchill was. Everybody agrees on basic facts, like that he was the Prime Minister of Britain during World War II. However, when you get into the details about who he was as a person and whether he was any good at his job, you get wildly different opinions. Some people think he was a strong and courageous hero who led the Allies to victory against the Nazis. Some people think that he was a self-absorbed opportunist who was unsuited to high office. So who was he? Now, Churchill was an amazing man, whatever you think of him, and there are wildly different opinions on him. But he wasn't Jesus. Jesus basically started a religion, whether he intended to or not. Now, maybe you're one of those people who thinks religion is a bad thing. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. All I'm saying is that Jesus was and is even more polarizing than Winston Churchill. People are still fired up about him 2,000 years later. You don't hear people getting as fired up about Julius Caesar today as they do about Jesus. And even if Churchill is at the level of historical greatness of Julius Caesar, nobody does controversy like religion, not even politics. My point in all this is that Jesus began a religion, or changed the course of one, depending on your point of view, and he told people how they should interact with God and what it meant to be truly human. So what do we do with that? What do you do with someone who tells you how to interact with God and what it means to be truly human? Because when you look at Jesus' life, you have to wrestle with all those big questions about God and humanity and yourself. And when we're tackling such huge topics, is it any wonder that none of us can be objective? So, what do we do? Well, one thing we can't do is divorce the Jesus of the Christian faith from the Jesus of history. In other words, the Christian faith is based on the actual Jesus of history. While people today might not know much about Jesus, or while they may be content to imagine him in a way that suits them, there was actually a real Jesus. And what is important about this is that the earliest Christians seem to believe that who he was and what he did was critical to Christianity. In other words, Christianity was not based on, simply whatever people wanted to believe about Jesus. It was based on the real person of Jesus. Now, Christianity might have strayed from those roots, but that's how it was founded. Let me give you a couple of examples to show that the early Christians, specifically the writers of the New Testament, really cared about who Jesus was, what he said, and what he did. First up, in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 and 12, Paul makes it clear that what he is about to say is his own opinion and not Jesus's, or the Lord's, as he says in the verses. He often claims, Paul often claims, that what he is saying to his audience comes from Jesus. However, here in 1 Corinthians 7, he is making it clear that what he is saying is not coming from Jesus, but is his own view. In other words, he doesn't want to put words into Jesus' mouth. If he does not have a specific command from Jesus or teaching that can be traced back to him, then he's not going to write like he did have one of those. The words and teaching of Jesus were important to Paul, and so he made a clear distinction between those that were from Jesus and those that were his own. Let me give you another example to show that the early Christians really cared about who Jesus actually was and were not okay with just making things up about it. There were a lot of important issues in the early church that didn't come up in Jesus' ministry. For example, how are Jews and Gentiles supposed to interact now that Gentiles are in the picture? You see, there were these two groups of people who didn't mesh well, but yet with Christianity they were now being combined. So how do you combine two groups of people who have very different patterns of life? There were a lot of problems that had to be worked out. What about circumcision for the Gentiles? Did the Gentiles have to become circumcised like the Jews? Do they have to become Jews first before they become Christians? Or can they just become Christians directly? What about eating food sacrificed to idols? To a Jew, this would be idolatry. To a Gentile, it would just be normal practice. You see, these were really divisive issues, but if you notice, the Gospels don't record Jesus saying anything about them. And these issues became contentious before the Gospels were written. Just think about it. How easy would it have been to just put an answer in Jesus' mouth and solve the issue? They could have just said, well, Jesus said that this is the answer, we just have to go with that. But the authors of the Gospels didn't do that. They didn't put words in Jesus' mouth. They really cared about what he said and didn't say. And they weren't just using him as a means to an end. The third example, it's the last one I'll give you, that helps you see that the early Christians really cared about who Jesus was and what he said and did, is that the theology we see in the New Testament is based on the person and work of Christ. When you look at the reasoning behind the theology in the New Testament, you will regularly see it running something like this. Because Christ is X, therefore the world is Y. Or because Christ did X, therefore Y is the way things will be, and you should act accordingly. Now, we've talked about this concept of because X, therefore Y in the series on Colossians, and we'll be talking about a lot more, both in the rest of that series as well as in other series. It's really common in Christian theology because it's really foundational. Now, there's more reasons to show that the early Christians, and especially the authors of the New Testament, cared about what Jesus actually said and did, but that should be enough to make the point. The Jesus of Christianity cannot be separated from the Jesus of history. Or we might say, the Christian faith cannot be separated from reality. If certain things are true, then Christianity is true. If certain things are not true, then Christianity is not true. Christianity is not just something to believe because you want to believe it. Some people definitely do that, but Christianity does not teach that. Christianity teaches that the world is a certain way and people should act accordingly. That's why we spend so much time going over topics like the existence of God. It actually matters whether there is a God or not. And it actually makes a difference who Jesus was. And that's what we're going to talk about in this series. Who was Jesus? Again, this is going to be a long series. This is just an introduction. Because, there's a lot to talk about Jesus. And probably the most basic question to ask is, did Jesus actually exist? That's going to be the topic for next week. So if this is a series that interests you, be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with it. Again, if you'd rather watch these, you can do so on my YouTube channel. I put a link in the description. You can also find some short videos on a variety of topics there if you're interested. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or cries of outrage, you can find me on Twitter at Matt Delacre or Facebook at facebook.com/Matt Delacre. I hope the series will be helpful to you. Let's get going.